When a grieving widow and her 2 children return home to find their house stripped bare by those they trusted most, the emptiness becomes unbearable. Betrayed by family, abandoned by friends, Sarah stands in a hollow shell of what was once her life. But beneath the floorboard of that violated home lies something her late husband left behind, something that will transform her despair into an unstoppable force. What she discovers won't just bring justice. It will rewrite everything she thought she knew about the man she loved, the people who betrayed her, and the strength she never knew she possessed. If you believe in justice and second chances, hit that like button and subscribe, because this story will stay with you long after it ends. The house stood at the end of Maple Drive like a monument to broken promises, its white paint peeling in long strips that curl away from the wood like skin after a burn. Sarah Mitchell stood before it with her 2 children flanking her sides, their small hands clutching the fabric of her worn coat, their breathing shallow in the November cold. The moving truck that brought them here 3 days ago had left tire marks in the gravel driveway, dark scars that reminded her of the tracks tears leave on a face that has cried too long. She had not wanted to return to this town, to this street, to this house where James had grown up and where they had planned to grow old together. But life, she had learned in the 6 months since his death, cared nothing for plans. The key felt foreign in her hand, heavier than it should have been, as though it knew what waited beyond that door. Her daughter Emma, only 7 years old, pressed closer against her hip, and Sarah could feel the child's heartbeat to the layers of winter clothing, rapid and afraid. Her son Michael, 10 years old and trying desperately to be the man he thought his father would have wanted, stood rigid with his jaw clenched, but his eyes betrayed him. They were James's eyes, hazel with flecks of gold that caught the light, and seeing them now made Sarah's chest constrict with a grief so physical it felt like drowning on dry land. She had promised them this would be a new beginning, that coming back to their father's childhood home would give them roots, stability, a foundation to rebuild upon. She had promised them safety. The door opened with sound like a sigh, and the emptiness that greeted them was not the emptiness of potential she had imagined. It was the emptiness of violation, of theft, of deliberate cruelty. The living room stretched before them, vast and naked, every piece of furniture gone. The couch where James's mother used to sit was absent. The dining table that had hosted 3 generations of family meals had vanished. The bookshelves his grandfather had built with his own hands, the photograph that had lined the mantel, the rugs that had covered the scar hardwood floors. All of it, every single thing, had been stripped away as cleanly as flesh from bone. Sarah stood in the doorway, unable to move, unable to process what her eyes were telling her, while her children made small sounds of confusion and fear behind her. They had been supposed to come here together, the 3 of them with James's brother David and his wife Catherine, to prepare the house for Sarah and the children to move in. But 2 days before the trip, David had called with an urgency in his voice that felt rehearsed, explaining that Catherine's father had fallen ill and they needed to rush to Portland immediately. He had been so apologetic, so insistent that Sarah and the kids go ahead without them, that the house keys were under Matt, that everything would be ready for them. He had sounded so sincere that Sarah had felt guilty for the tiny whisper of suspicion that had flickered through her mind. Now, standing in this gutted house, that whisper became a scream. David and Catherine had not gone to Portland. They had come here first, with a truck and helpers, and they had taken everything. The silence in the house was not peaceful. It was a silence of absence, of things ripped away, of spaces where life used to be. Sarah walked through rooms like a ghost haunting her own future, her footsteps echoing too loudly on the bare floors. Each empty room was a fresh wound. The kitchen cabinets hung open like mouths crying out, every dish and pot and utensil removed. The bedroom where she and James had slept during summer visits now contained nothing but dust and shadows. Even the curtains had been taken, leaving the windows naked and exposed, letting in a gray November light that made everything look like a photograph of a crime scene. Emma began to cry, soft hiccuping sobs as she tried to muffle against her mother's coat, and Michael kicked at the wall with a violence that frightened Sarah more than his tears would have. She wanted to gather them both in her arms and run, to leave this place and never return. But there was nowhere else to go. This house, this empty, violated shell, was all they had left. The first night passed like a fever dream. The three of them huddled together in sleeping bags on the floor of what should have been Sarah's bedroom, their bodies pressed close for warmth that the house's broken heating system could not provide. Sarah had tried to call David 17 times, and each call had gone straight to voicemail, his cheerful recorded voice mocking her with its casual friendliness. She had texted Catherine, reaching out woman to woman, mother to mother, tried to appeal to some dormant compassion she prayed still existed beneath whatever darkness had led them to this betrayal. The messages remained unread, the little check marks refusing to turn blue. And Sarah had finally set her phone face down on the floor beside her and stared up at the ceiling where water stains bloomed like bruises across the plaster. Emma had finally fallen asleep after 2 hours of quiet crying, her small body twitching occasionally with the aftershocks of grief and fear. Michael lay awake staring at the wall, and Sarah could feel his anger radiating off him like heat from a fire. He had adored his Uncle David, had looked up to him with the uncomplicated worship that children reserve for the adults who pay them attention. David had taught Michael to fish, to throw a football, to fix a flat tire on a bicycle. He had been there at the funeral standing beside Sarah as they lowered James into ground, his hand on Michael's shoulder, his voice breaking as he spoke about brotherhood and love and how they would always be family. Sarah had believed him. She had believed all of it. And now that belief felt like the cruelest joke the universe had ever told. When dawn finally came, it brought no comfort, only a harsh gray light that made the emptiness more apparent. Sarah rose stiffly from the sleeping bag, her back aching from the hard floor, and walked through the house again as though hoping the furniture might have returned during the night like some reverse fairy tale. But nothing had changed. The house remained gutted, picked clean, a carcass left behind by scavengers. She found herself in the kitchen, standing in the center of that empty room. Try to remember how it had looked when James's mother was alive, when the counters had been covered with cooling pies and the air had smelled of cinnamon and coffee and love. She could almost see it, almost touch that phantom past, but the present kept intruding with its cold, concrete reality. The refrigerator was still there, at least. Too old and heavy to be worth stealing, apparently. But it was unplugged and standing open, its interior stained with the ghosts of forgotten meals. Sarah opened the freezer compartment without knowing why, some automatic gesture born from years of checking for ice cream to soothe her children's hurts, and found it empty except for a thin layer of frost. She was about to close it when something caught her eye, a darkness visible through the ice at the back of the compartment. Something that did not belong. She reached in and felt along the metal wall, her fingers going numb from the cold, and found a seam, a gap, a place where the metal backing had been loosened. Her heart began to beat faster, though she did not yet understand why. She called Michael to bring her a screwdriver from the toolkit in their car, one of the few possessions they had brought with them, and when he returned she worked the tip into the seam and pried gently. The metal panel came away with surprising ease, and behind it, wedged into the insulation and wrapped in several layers of plastic, was a large manila envelope. Sarah's hands trembled as she pulled it free, as she peeled away the plastic wrapping, as she opened the envelope's clasp and looked inside. There were documents, dozens of them, photocopies and originals, bank statements and legal papers and photographs, all organized with the meticulous care that had been James's trademark. And on top of everything, in his familiar handwriting on a yellow sticky note, were 4 words that made Sarah's breath catch in her throat. In case something happens. She carried the envelope to the living room where the morning light was strongest and spread its contents across the floor while Emma and Michael watched with wide, curious eyes. What emerged as she sorted through the papers was a story she had never known, a hidden narrative that had been running parallel to her life, like a secret river beneath the earth. James had suspected David. For years, apparently, James had been quietly documenting his brother's activities, gathering evidence of financial fraud, of embezzlement from their late father's business, of forged documents and false statements, and money disappearing into accounts that should not have existed. The papers laid it all out with devastating clarity. David had been stealing from the family for nearly a decade, and James had known. But why had James never told her? Sarah sat back on her heels, tried to understand, trying to fit this revelation into the shape of the man she had loved. The documents were dated, the most recent from just 2 weeks before James's accident, and as she looked through them she began to see the pattern. James had been building a case, collecting evidence not to destroy his brother but to confront him, to force him into making restitution, to give him a chance at redemption. There were draft letters among the papers, multiple versions of the same message, James's handwriting crossing out words and rewriting them, trying to find the right tone, the right approach. He had been planning to show David the evidence, to give him an ultimatum, return the money, come clean to the family, or face criminal charges. He had been planning to do it the week after his accident, the accident that had killed him. Sarah felt something cold spreading through her chest as she looked at the police report she had requested a month ago and filed away without really reading, too consumed by grief to process its details. James had died when his car left the road on Highway 27 and struck a tree. The police had ruled it an accident, citing wet conditions and a sharp curve, but James had driven that road 1,000 times. He knew every twist and turn, every dangerous spot, every place where caution was required. And now, looking at these documents, looking at the timing, Sarah felt a question forming that she did not want to ask, a suspicion so dark and terrible that it made her stomach turn. Had David known? Had James confronted him before the accident? And if he had, what had David done? She gathered the children and sat them down, her voice shaking as she tried to explain what she found in terms they could understand. She showed them their father's handwriting. Let them see that these were his words, his work, his attempt to protect the family even after he was gone. Michael's face went through a series of transformations as he listened, confusion, then understanding, then a rage so pure and focused it frightened Sarah to see it on a child's face. Emma simply held her mother's hand and cried, not understanding most of what was being said, but feeling the weight of it pressing down on all of them like a physical force. And Sarah, holding her children close, felt something igniting inside her that had been dormant since James died. Not just anger, though there was plenty of that. Not just grief, though it threatened to consume her. But purpose, direction, a reason to keep moving forward that went beyond simple survival. They spent the rest of that day reading through every document, Sarah making notes and organizing the papers into categories while the children sat nearby doing homework on the floor. The house remained empty and cold around them, but somehow it felt less oppressive now, as though James's presence had returned in the form of these carefully preserved papers. Sarah found herself talking to him as she worked, whispering questions and imagining his answers, feeling closer to him than she had since the funeral. What had he been thinking as he hid this envelope? Had he suspected what David might do? Had he known, somehow, that he would not live to confront his brother himself? The questions multiplied faster than answers could form, but one thing became increasingly clear as the afternoon wore on. James had left her a weapon, and he had trusted her to know how to use it. As evening fell and the temperature dropped, Sarah made a decision. She could not stay in this house, not like this, not with her children sleeping on bare floors in the cold. She needed help, but she could not go to David's friends or the family members who had sided with him after James's death, who had whispered that she was too demanding, too emotional, too unwilling to let the family move on. Instead, she called the one person she thought might still remember who James really was. His college roommate Marcus, who had moved to Portland 10 years ago and whom she had not spoken to since the funeral. The phone rang 4 times before he answered, and when she heard his voice, warm and surprised and genuinely happy to hear from her, Sarah felt tears starting to form. She explained the situation in short clipped sentences, afraid that if she said too much she would break down completely. Marcus listened without interrupting, and when she finished there was a long silence before he spoke 3 words that made her shoulders sag with relief. "I'm coming tonight." Marcus arrived just after midnight, his truck loaded with sleeping bags, a portable heater, groceries, and a grim determination that reminded Sarah of James in his most focused moments. He took one look at the empty house, at Sarah's exhausted face, at the children sleeping on the floor, and his jaw tightened with an anger that needed no explanation. They sat in the kitchen drinking coffee from paper cups while the portable heater hummed in the corner, and Sarah showed him the documents. Marcus had been an accountant before switching careers to nonprofit work, and he went through the papers with a professional eye, occasionally stopping to make notes or ask questions. When he finished, he looked at Sarah with an expression that mixed admiration and sorrow. "James was thorough," he said quietly. "This is airtight. David's going to prison if this gets into the right hands." But getting it into the right hands required strategy, required patience, required thinking 3 moves ahead the way James always had. They could not simply go to the police. David had connections in the department through his father-in-law, and there was a risk that evidence might disappear or be discredited before it could be properly documented. They could not confront David directly. He had already shown himself willing to steal from a widow and leave children homeless, and there was no telling what else he might do if he felt cornered. No, they needed to be smart about this, needed to build a case that was so solid and so public that David would have no escape route, no way to charm or bribe or threaten his way out of consequences. Marcus suggested they start by reaching out to a lawyer he knew in Portland, someone who specialized in family law and estate disputes, someone who would understand the nuances of what David had done and know how to pursue it through proper legal channels. Sarah listened to all of this, grateful for Marcus's level-headed approach, but she found herself thinking about something else, something that had been nagging at her since she first saw those documents. David and Catherine had not just stolen furniture. They had stolen family heirlooms, photographs, things that had belonged to James's grandparents and great-grandparents, things that had no significant monetary value, but were priceless in terms of memory and history. That kind of theft spoke to something deeper than simple greed. It spoke to cruelty, to a desire not just to profit but to hurt, to erase, to deny Sarah and her children even the comfort of connection to their past. And as she thought about this, another question formed. What else had David taken? What else had James hidden? She asked Marcus to stay with the children while she walked through the house one more time, this time not looking at what was missing, but at what remained. The old refrigerator with its hidden compartment, the bare walls with their water stains and nail holes, the floors with their scratches and worn patches. James had grown up in this house. He had known every corner, every hiding spot, every secret place where a boy might stash treasures or a man might conceal evidence. If he had hidden the manila envelope in the freezer, what else might he have hidden elsewhere? Sarah moved slowly from room to room, running her hand along the walls, pressing on floorboards, looking for anything that felt loose or hollow or out of place. In the bedroom that had been James's as a child, she found something. A baseboard near the closet shifted slightly when she pressed on it, and when she worked her fingers behind it, she could feel empty space. Her heart racing. She called for Marcus to bring the screwdriver again, and together they carefully removed a section of baseboard to reveal a small cavity in the wall. Inside was another envelope, this one smaller, and inside that envelope were photographs, dozens of them, some old and faded, some more recent, all showing David in various compromising situations. There were pictures of him entering hotels with women who were not his wife, pictures of him meeting with men who looked distinctly uncomfortable being photographed, pictures of him loading boxes into a truck in the middle of the night from the family business's warehouse. And beneath the photographs, a letter in James's handwriting, dated just 3 days before his death, addressed to Sarah. She read it with trembling hands, Marcus looking over her shoulder, both of them silent as the words on the page revealed the final piece of the puzzle. James had confronted David. He had shown him some of the evidence, had given him a chance to come clean, and David had responded not with remorse, but with threats. He had told James that if he went public with the allegations, he would destroy Sarah's reputation, would claim that she had been stealing from James, would make sure she lost custody of the children. James had not believed the threats would amount to anything. David was a thief, but not a monster, he had written. But he wanted Sarah to know the truth if anything happened to him. He wanted her to know that David was desperate and dangerous, that he was willing to do anything to protect his secrets, and that she needed to be careful, to be smart, to use the evidence wisely and not to trust David under any circumstances. The letter ended with words that made Sarah weep. You are stronger than you know, you are braver than you believe, and you are loved more than you can imagine. If you're reading this, it means I'm gone, and I am so sorry to leave you with this burden. But I know you will do what's right. I know you will protect our children. I know you will not let them win. I love you, Sarah. I have always loved you. And I will love you beyond death, beyond darkness, beyond everything that tries to separate us. You are not alone. You have never been alone. And when this is over, when justice is done, I need you to promise me something. Live. Not just survive, but live. Find joy again. Let the children see you smile. Let them know that even when the worst happens, even when the world feels like it's ending, there is still beauty and hope and reasons to keep going. That's my last gift to you. Permission to be happy again. Don't waste it. Morning came with a clarity that felt almost cruel in its brightness. Sunlight streaming through bare windows and illuminating every crack and flaw in the empty house. Sarah had not slept at all, had spent the entire night sitting in the kitchen with Marcus going through the documents and photographs one more time, creating a timeline, building a narrative, preparing for what would come next. The children woke to find their mother red-eyed but determined, her jaw set in a way they had not seen since before their father's death. Marcus made breakfast from the supplies he had brought, scrambled eggs and toast cooked on a portable camping stove, and they ate sitting on a living room floor, like they were on some strange indoor camping trip. Emma seemed to have decided this was an adventure, her 7-year-old mind protecting her from the full weight of what was happening by turning it into a story. Michael remained quiet, watchful, his father's eyes tracking every movement his mother made, as though trying to divine her plans. After breakfast, Sarah called a lawyer Marcus had recommended, a woman named Patricia Chun who listened to the entire story without interrupting, and then said 5 words that made Sarah's shoulders relax for the first time in days. I'll take the case pro bono. Patricia explained that she had been following stories about estate theft and family fraud, that she believed the legal system had been failing widows and orphans for far too long, and that she saw Sarah's case as an opportunity to set a precedent that might help others in similar situations. She asked Sarah to scan and email every document James had hidden, every photograph, every piece of evidence, and promised to begin building a case immediately. But she also warned Sarah that this would not be quick or easy, that David would fight back, that things might get worse before it got better, and that Sarah needed to be prepared for a long battle. Sarah assured her she was prepared for whatever came next, but as she hung up the phone, she felt a wave of doubt crash over her. Was she really ready for this? She was a widow with 2 young children, no job, no money beyond what remained of James's life insurance, and no support system beyond one loyal friend who had driven through the night to help her. David, on the other hand, had money, connections, a wife whose family had influence in the community, and a complete willingness to lie, cheat, and manipulate to get what he wanted. The odds were not in her favor. But then she thought about James's letter, about his belief in her strength, about his final request that she not just survive but live. And she felt something hardening inside her like steel being forged in fire. She would fight, she would win, and she would make sure David faced every consequence he had spent years running from. The first step, Patricia had explained, was to document everything that had been stolen from the house. Sarah needed to create a comprehensive inventory of every piece of furniture, every family heirloom, every item that David and Catherine had taken. This proved more difficult than Sarah had anticipated. She had only visited the house a handful of times over the years, always during holidays or brief summer stays, and she had never paid close attention to its contents. She called James's Aunt Dorothy, his father's sister, who was 83 years old and living in a nursing home 2 towns over. Dorothy had helped furnish the house when James's parents first bought it 50 years ago, and her memory for details was sharp despite her age. Over the phone, in a voice that trembled with outrage when Sarah explained what David had done, Dorothy described every piece of furniture, every decoration, every item of value that should have been in that house. Sarah wrote it all down, creating a list that ran to 7 pages, each item a small monument to what had been lost. But Dorothy gave Sarah something more valuable than just an inventory. She told her about the family history, about the relationships and resentments that had shaped the brothers' lives. David had always been jealous of James, Dorothy explained. James was the older brother, the responsible one, the one their father had trusted with the business. David was a charming one, the smooth talker, the one who could make people laugh at parties, but who could never quite measure up to his brother's steady reliability. Their father had known about David's shortcomings, had caught him stealing from the business once when David was in his 20s. But instead of pressing charges, he had covered up, had paid back the money himself, had given David another chance. It had been the wrong decision, Dorothy said with sadness in her voice. It had taught David that he could get away with anything. That family loyalty would always protect him from consequences. That love meant never having to face the truth about yourself. After talking to Dorothy, Sarah began to understand the deeper dimensions of what David had done. This was not just about greed or inheritance or even the specific items he had stolen. This was about a lifetime of resentment, about a man who had spent decades living in his brother's shadow, and who saw James's death as an opportunity to finally eclipse him, to take everything he had never earned, to rewrite the family story with himself as a hero rather than the disappointment. And the cruelty he had shown towards Sarah and the children was not incidental. It was essential to his narrative. By taking everything from them, by leaving them with nothing, he was erasing James from the family legacy, claiming all their father's assets for himself, becoming the only son who mattered. It was psychological warfare disguised as estate management, and it had been executed with a precision that suggested he had been planning it for years. This realization changed something in Sarah. She had been thinking of this as a legal battle, a matter of recovering stolen property and holding David accountable for his crimes. But now she understood it was also a battle for memory, for history, for the truth about who James had been and what he had meant to his family. David was not just stealing furniture. He was stealing the story, and if Sarah did not fight back, his version of events would become the official record. Future generations would know James only through David's lens, would hear only David's carefully edited accounts of their childhood, would believe that David had been the good son and James had somehow been lacking. Sarah could not let that happen. She would not let David rewrite her husband's life to serve his own ends. Marcus had to return to Portland for work, but promised to come back the following weekend with more supplies, and whatever help Sarah needed. Before he left, he did something that moved Sarah to tears. He went into town and bought 3 air mattresses pillows, blankets, a space heater, and enough groceries to last a week. He set up a makeshift bedroom in the largest room of the house, creating a space that felt almost cozy despite the bare walls and empty corners. He also bought a padlock to the front door, explaining that if David was willing to steal furniture, he might be willing to come back for more, and Sarah needed to secure her position. As Marcus drove away, Sarah stood in the driveway watching his taillights disappear and feeling an overwhelming gratitude for people who show up, who do the work, who care even when it is difficult and inconvenient and unrewarded. The next few days passed in a strange suspended state, like living inside a hell breath. Patricia was working on the legal case, making calls to prosecutors and judges, filing motions, and gathering evidence. Sarah was working on the practical matters, calling utility companies to get electricity and water turned back on, contacting the school to enroll Emma and Michael, trying to create some semblance of normal life for her children in this empty house. The air mattresses helped, as did the space heater, and Sarah found that she was sleeping better than she had in months, perhaps because she finally had a purpose beyond simply getting through each day. The children adapted with a resilience that always amazes adults. Emma turned the empty house into a canvas for her imagination, inventing elaborate games that involved every room, while Michael threw himself into his schoolwork with a focus that seemed almost meditative. But beneath the surface of adjustment, Sarah was planning. She had started driving around town, noting the locations of David's house, his office, the family business he now ran alone, the coffee shop where Dorothy said he ate breakfast every morning. She was not stalking him. She was studying him, learning his patterns, understanding his world the way a general studies terrain before a battle. She knew she could not confront him directly. Not yet, not until Patricia gave her the signal that the legal case was ready to move forward. But she wanted to be prepared, wanted to know where he was and what he was doing, wanted to understand the scope of his life, so that when justice finally came for him, it would come from every direction at once. One afternoon, while the children were at school, Sarah drove to the family business's warehouse on the edge of town. It was a large metal building surrounded by a chain-link fence, unremarkable except for the sign out front that read Mitchell & Sons Distribution in fading letters. Sarah's father-in-law had founded the business 40 years ago as a small trucking operation and had built it into a regional distribution network that served businesses across 3 states. When he died 5 years ago, he had left the business to both his sons equally, trusting them to run it together, believing that shared ownership would force them to work through their differences. But according to James's documents, David had been systematically pushing James out, making decisions without consulting him, changing locks and passwords, redirecting profits into accounts that James could not access. By the time of James's death, he had effectively been an owner in name only. Sarah sat in her car across the street from the warehouse, watching workers load and unload trucks, watching David's BMW pull into the parking lot just after 3 o'clock, watching him walk into the building with the confident stride of a man who believed he had gotten away with everything. She felt rage building in her chest, hot and pure and clarifying, but she did not let it control her. Instead, she took photographs with her phone, pictures of the building, the sign, David's car, the timestamp showing the date and location. Patricia had told her to document everything, to create a visual record that could be used in court, and Sarah was determined to be thorough. She stayed until David left at 5:30, then drove home feeling like a spy in her own life, like someone playing a role in a movie rather than living actual events. That evening, after dinner and homework and bedtime stories, Sarah sat alone in the empty living room with James's letter in her hands. She read it again, slowly, letting each word sink in deeper than before. The part about living, about finding joy, about letting the children see her smile. Those words haunted her because they asked something of her that felt impossible. How could she find joy when she was living in an empty house that had been stripped by thieves? How could she smile when every day was a struggle to maintain basic dignity? How could she model happiness for her children when she woke up every morning with grief sitting on her chest like a physical weight? But James had not asked her to feel joy immediately. He had asked her to find it, which implied a search, a journey, a process rather than a destination. And maybe, she thought, the journey had already begun. Maybe standing up to David, fighting for justice, refusing to be victimized. Maybe that was a first step toward reclaiming her life. She thought about calling David, about confronting him directly, about asking him how he could do this to his brother's family. But she knew what he would say. He would deny everything, would claim he had a right to the furniture because it had belonged to his parents, would twist the facts until she doubted her own perception of reality. Men like David were experts at gaslighting, at making their victims question what they knew to be true. Sarah had seen him do it to James, had watched him rewrite conversations and deny promises and make James feel like he was the one being unreasonable. She would not give David that power over her. Instead, she would let the evidence speak, would let the law do what families had failed to do, would let the weight of James's carefully assembled case crush David's lies into dust. The call from Patricia came on a Thursday morning 3 weeks after Sarah had found the hidden documents. Patricia's voice was excited but controlled, the tone of someone trying to remain professional while delivering news they can barely contain. The district attorney had reviewed the evidence and agreed to open an investigation into David's activities. They were particularly interested in the embezzlement from the family business, which had crossed state lines and therefore involved federal fraud statutes. Patricia explained that investigators would be contacting Sarah for formal statements, that they would need to verify the authenticity of James's documents, that this was the beginning of a process that could take months or even years to complete. But it was happening. The machinery of justice was beginning to turn, slowly and inexorably, and David would soon find himself caught in gears he could neither stop nor escape. Sarah thanked Patricia and ended the call, then sat very still in the kitchen letting the news wash over her. She had expected to feel triumphant, victorious, vindicated. Instead, she felt tired, old beyond her years, weighed down by the knowledge of what was coming. The investigation would be invasive. They would dig into every aspect of James's life and hers, would question her motives, would wonder if she was motivated by justice or revenge. David would hire expensive lawyers who would attack her character, would try to paint her as a bitter widow trying to destroy her brother-in-law out of spite. The children would be questioned, would have to testify about what they remembered of their father and uncle, would be forced to relive the trauma loss over and over again in depositions and courtrooms. It would be brutal and exhausting and probably take years to resolve. But it was necessary. It was right, and it was what James had prepared her to do. She decided not to tell the children about the investigation yet. They were too young to understand complexities, and she did not want them walking around school carrying secrets that might slip out at the wrong moment. Instead, she focused on building their routine, on creating a life that felt stable and normal despite the empty house and the legal battle brewing beneath the surface. She got a part-time job at the library in town, shelving books and helping patrons with research, work that was quiet and methodical and gave her time to think. The pay was minimal, but it was enough to supplement the life insurance money, enough to buy food and clothes and school supplies, enough to let her feel like she was supporting her family rather than merely surviving on James's death. Emma thrived at her new school, making friends with the easy confidence that had always been her gift. Michael struggled more. He was quiet and withdrawn, spending his lunch periods in the library reading books about war and strategy and famous generals. Sarah worried about him, worried that he was retreating into fantasies of conflict and conquest instead of processing his grief in healthy ways. She tried to talk to him about it one evening, sitting beside him on his air mattress after Emma had fallen asleep, asking him what he was thinking about, what he was feeling, whether he wanted to talk to someone professional about losing his father. Michael had looked at her with those hazel eyes, so like James's, and said something that chilled her. "I'm not sad anymore, Mom. I'm just waiting." Waiting for what? She had asked, though she thought she knew. Waiting for David to face consequences. Waiting for justice. Waiting for the world to acknowledge what had been done to them and make it right. Michael did not say any of this explicitly, but Sarah heard it in his tone, saw it in the set of his shoulders. Her 10-year-old son had become a warrior in waiting, a child soldier preparing for a battle he should never have had to fight. She wanted to tell him that revenge would not heal him, that justice would not bring his father back, that he needed to find a way to be a child again before the anger consumed him completely. But she also understood that he had earned his rage, that he had a right to want David punished, that his feelings were valid even if they frightened her. So instead of lecturing him, she simply held him, and eventually he cried, great heaving sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deep and primal, and she held him through it all, whispering that it was okay, that she loved him, that they would get through this together. The first sign that David knew about the investigation came in the form of a lawyer's letter delivered to Sarah's house by certified mail. The letter was full of legal jargon and veiled threats, claiming that Sarah had made defamatory statements about David, that she was in possession of stolen documents, that she was interfering with his lawful ownership of the family business. It demanded that she cease and desist from all investigations, that she return any documents or materials that belonged to the Mitchell family estate, and that she issue a public apology for any harm to David's reputation. The letter concluded by threatening legal action if Sarah did not comply within 10 business days. Sarah read it twice, her hands shaking with anger, then called Patricia, who laughed, and said this was the best thing that could have happened. "It means he's scared," Patricia explained. "It means he knows we have something real. People who are innocent don't send threatening letters. They cooperate with investigations. This just made our case stronger." Sarah drove home in a daze, her mind racing through every possible response and finding none that seemed adequate. How could she fight this? How could she prove that she was a good mother when David could simply make anonymous phone calls claiming otherwise? The system was designed to protect children, which meant it was also designed to believe the worst about parents, to investigate every allegation no matter how baseless, to err on the side of removing children from homes rather than leaving them in potential danger. Sarah called Patricia in a panic, barely coherent as she explained what had happened. And Patricia's response was swift and reassuring. "Document everything," she said firmly. "Document every meal you make, every conversation you have with the children, every moment of care and attention you provide. Take photographs. Keep receipts. Create a record so detailed and comprehensive that no one can question your fitness as a mother. And I'll file a motion alleging that David is using false allegations as a form of harassment. We'll turn this around on him." The investigation by Child Protective Services was one of the most humiliating experiences of Sarah's life. A social worker came to the house unannounced on a Wednesday morning, a thin woman in her 40s with tired eyes and a clipboard who introduced herself as Janet Morrison and said she needed to inspect the home and interview the children. Sarah tried to remain calm as Janet walked through the empty rooms, making notes about the lack of furniture, the air mattresses on the floor, the portable heater that provided inadequate warmth. Sarah explained about David stealing everything, showed Janet the police report she had filed, provided Patricia's contact information, so Janet could verify that a legal case was in progress. But she could see the doubt in Janet's eyes, the unspoken question of what kind of mother would bring children to live in an empty house, even temporarily, even after being robbed. The interviews with Emma and Michael were worse. Janet spoke to them separately, asking questions about their daily routine, their meals, their mother's behavior, whether anyone had ever hurt them or made them feel unsafe. Emma, being 7, answered with cheerful honesty, describing their life as an adventure, talking about how they slept in sleeping bags and ate picnics on the floor, and played games in the empty rooms. Her innocence was both endearing and damning. She did not understand that their living situation was supposed to be evidence of neglect rather than a charming eccentricity. Michael, being older and more aware of the stakes, was cautious and defensive, giving minimal answers, watching Janet with suspicion. Sarah could see him calculating, try to figure out if this woman was friend or enemy, ally or threat. When Janet finally left after 2 hours, promising that she would complete her investigation and be in touch soon, Sarah collapsed on the floor and cried until she had no tears left. But Sarah was learning something important through all of this. She was learning that she was stronger than she had believed, that she could endure humiliation and fear and still function, still care for her children, still move forward with her life. Every attack David launched, every attempt to discredit or intimidate or destroy her, revealed something about his desperation. He was not acting like a man confident in his innocence. He was acting like a cornered animal, dangerous and unpredictable, willing to do anything to escape the trap closing around him. And that meant the investigation was working. The evidence was solid. The case was building. David could feel it happening and was lashing out in increasingly reckless ways. Patricia called with an update. The federal investigation had uncovered evidence that David had been embezzling for even longer than James had documented, possibly as far back as 15 years. The amounts were staggering. Well over $2 million siphoned from the business through fake invoices, ghost employees, and inflated contract with companies that either did not exist or controlled by David himself. The investigators had also found evidence that David had forged her father's signature on documents transferring business assets to himself after the old man had died, effectively stealing Michael and Emma's inheritance before they were even aware they had won. Patricia explained that the U.S. Attorney's Office was now preparing criminal charges, likely multiple felony counts of wire fraud, tax evasion, and forgery. David was going to prison. It was no longer a question of if, but when. Sarah should have felt vindicated, but instead she felt hollow. This was what James had died trying to stop. This was what he had documented and hidden and tried to handle quietly within the family. If he had lived another week, if he had confronted David with the evidence, if things had gone differently, would David have backed down? Would he have agreed to return the money? Or would he have done something worse? Sarah kept coming back to the question she did not want to ask, the dark suspicion that grew stronger every time she looked at the timeline. James had confronted David on a Monday. James had died on a Thursday. The police report said there were no mechanical problems with the car, no evidence of alcohol or drugs, nothing to explain why he had lost control on a road he knew intimately. Just wet pavement and a sharp curve and bad luck. But what if it was not luck at all? What if David had done something to the car? What if he had followed James that night and forced him off the road? What if James's death was not an accident but murder? She brought these questions to Patricia, who listened gravely and then explained the reality of proving such allegations. Without physical evidence, without witnesses or forensics or some concrete proof of foul play, it would be nearly impossible to convince anyone to reopen the investigation into James's death. The car had been totaled and scrapped months ago. The road where it happened had been driven by thousands of vehicles since then. Any evidence that might have existed was long gone, destroyed by time and weather and the normal processes of moving on. Patricia did not say it was impossible, but she made it clear that pursuing this theory would require resources Sarah did not have and might ultimately damage the strong case they had built around embezzlement and theft. Sometimes, Patricia said gently, we have to accept that we cannot know everything, cannot prove everything, cannot achieve perfect justice in an imperfect world. Sometimes we have to settle for what we can prove and let the rest remain in the realm of suspicion and grief. Sarah understood what Patricia was saying, but she could not let it go. She started researching James's accident obsessively, reading the police report over and over, looking at photographs of the scene, studying the diagram that showed where the car had left the road. She contacted the investigating officer, a veteran named Sergeant Davis, who remembered the case, and agreed to meet with her at a coffee shop downtown. Davis was sympathetic but firm. He had seen no evidence of anything other than an unfortunate accident. The road was dangerous. The weather was bad. James might have been distracted or tired. These things happen. Davis had investigated thousands of accidents in his 30-year career, and he could tell the difference between bad luck and foul play. This was bad luck, he insisted, terrible luck, but luck nonetheless. Except Sarah noticed something as they talked, a small detail that Davis mentioned almost in passing. There had been a witness, an elderly man who lived in a house near the curve where James crashed. The man had heard the sound of the accident and called 911, but he had also mentioned hearing another car leaving the scene quickly, driving away at high speed just after crash. Davis had interviewed the man the following day, but the witness could not provide any useful details. He had not seen the other car, could not describe it, was not even sure it was connected to the accident. It might have been coincidence, someone driving past and not realizing there had been a crash, or it might have been a figment of an old man's imagination. Davis had noted it in his report, but had not pursued it further because there was no evidence to suggest it mattered. Sarah asked for the witness's name and address, and Davis hesitated before providing them. He warned her not to harass the man, not to try to convince him to change his story, not to do anything that might compromise the integrity of the original investigation. Sarah promised she just wanted to talk to him, to understand what he had seen and heard, to satisfy her own need for closure. Davis seemed unconvinced but gave her the information anyway, perhaps because he understood that grief sometimes requires its own investigation, its own process of making sense of the senseless. Sarah thanked him and left the coffee shop feeling a mixture of hope and dread, knowing she was about to open a door she might not be able to close. The witness's name was Arthur Pemberton, and he lived in a small cottage at the edge of town, set back from the road behind a row of pine trees. Sarah drove there on a Saturday afternoon, bringing the children with her, because she did not want to seem threatening, and thought an elderly man might be more comfortable with a woman and children than with a woman alone. Arthur answered the door slowly, a frail man in his 80s with white hair and thick glasses, and when Sarah explained who she was and why she'd come, his face crumpled with sympathy. He invited them all inside, offered cookies and milk to the children, and sat Sarah down in his living room where photographs of his own children and grandchildren lined every surface. He remembered the night of James's accident vividly, he said, because it had troubled him ever since. Arthur explained that he had been watching television that evening when he heard the sound of squealing tires followed by a tremendous crash. He had immediately gone to his phone and called 911, but before the operator answered, he had heard another sound, an engine revving, a car accelerating away from the scene at high speed. It had struck him as wrong, he said, because if someone had witnessed an accident, they should have stopped to help, not fled as though they were escaping something. He had mentioned this to Sergeant Davis when Davis came to interview him, but Davis had seemed uninterested, focused instead on what Arthur had seen rather than what he had heard. Arthur admitted that he had not seen the second car, could not swear it was even there, but he knew what he had heard, and that knowledge had haunted him for months, had made him wonder if he should have insisted on a more thorough investigation, should have pushed harder to make someone listen. Sarah felt ice forming in her veins as she listened to Arthur speak. This was not proof. It was barely even evidence, but it was enough to confirm her suspicions, enough to transform her grief into something sharper and more focused. Someone had been there the night James died. Someone had heard the crash, and instead of stopping to help had fled the scene. And that someone might have been David, checking to make sure his brother was dead, making sure the evidence of confrontation and threat would die along with James in that crumpled car. Sarah thanked Arthur for his time, gave him Patricia's contact information in case the investigation was ever reopened, and drove home with her mind churning through possibilities and implications and the terrible knowledge that she might never be able to prove what she now believed to be true. That evening, after the children were in bed, Sarah sat in the empty living room with her phone in her hand, staring at David's number in her contacts. She wanted to call him. She wanted to scream at him, to accuse him, to make him confess what he had done. But she knew that would accomplish nothing except giving him warning that she suspected him, allowing him to prepare his defenses, to concoct alibis, to destroy whatever evidence might still exist. Instead, she called Patricia and told her everything. About Arthur Pemberton, about the car that fled the scene, about her growing certainty that James's death was not an accident. Patricia listened without judgment, and then said something that Sarah would remember for the rest of her life. Even if we cannot prove what happened to James, we can make sure David pays for what he definitely did do. We can make sure he goes to prison for the embezzlement and theft. We can make sure he loses everything, his freedom, his reputation, his ability to hurt anyone else. That's not perfect justice, but it's real justice. And sometimes real justice is all we get. The federal indictment came down on a cold morning in early March, exactly 4 months after Sarah had found the hidden documents in the freezer. Patricia called at 7 a.m. to tell her that David had been arrested at his home, that federal marshals had taken him into custody, that the charges included 14 felony counts of wire fraud, tax evasion, money laundering, and theft from an interstate business. The bail hearing was scheduled for that afternoon, and Patricia wanted to know if Sarah planned to attend. Sarah said yes without hesitation, though her hands were shaking as she hung up the phone. She had been waiting for this moment since the day she stood in the empty house and understood what David had done, and now that it was here, she felt strangely calm, as though some part of her had always known this was inevitable. She dressed carefully that morning, choosing clothes that were professional but not expensive, wanted to look like a widow seeking justice rather than a vengeful woman seeking revenge. She drove to the federal courthouse downtown and found Patricia waiting for her on the steps, briefcase in hand and an expression of grim satisfaction on her face. They went through security together and found seats in the courtroom gallery, surrounded by journalists who had caught wind of the case and showed up looking for a story. David was let in through a side door wearing an orange jumpsuit and handcuffs, his face pale and his eyes darting around the room until they landed on Sarah. For a moment their gazes locked, and Sarah saw something in his expression that confirmed everything she had suspected. Not remorse, not fear, but rage. Pure, undiluted rage at being caught, at being exposed, at losing the game he had thought he was winning. He looked at her as though she were the criminal, as though she had betrayed him rather than the other way around. And in that moment, Sarah understood that men like David never accept responsibility for their actions. They always find someone else to blame. The bail hearing was brief but dramatic. David's lawyer, an expensive-looking man in a tailored suit, argued that his client was a respected businessman with deep ties to the community, that he was not a flight risk, that he should be released on his own recognizance pending trial. The federal prosecutor, a sharp young woman named Rebecca Torres, countered by presenting evidence that David had been moving money to offshore accounts, that he had recently applied for a passport under a false name, that he had every reason and means to flee the country if given a chance. She also mentioned, almost casually, that there were questions about David's possible involvement in his brother's death, that the investigation into that incident was being reopened based on new information, and that these circumstances made him an extreme flight risk. The judge, a stern woman in her 60s, listened to both arguments and then set bail at $5 million, an amount so high that it was effectively a denial of release. David would remain in custody until trial. As the marshals led David away, he turned back one more time to look at Sarah, and this time he mouthed 3 words that she could read clearly even across the crowded courtroom. "You'll pay for this." Sarah felt fear flutter in her chest, but it was quickly replaced by something stronger, a sense of having crossed a threshold, of having stepped through a door that could not be walked back through. Whatever David had meant as a threat, Sarah heard as an admission. He was guilty. He knew it, and now everyone else would know it too. Patricia squeezed her hand as they stood to leave and whispered, "We got him. It's over." But Sarah knew it was not over. Not really. Not until the trial was complete and the verdict was rendered and David was sentenced to whatever punishment the law deemed appropriate. Still, this was a victory, a real tangible victory, and Sarah allowed herself to feel it, to savor it, to carry it home like a precious thing. The news of David's arrest spread to the town like wildfire, and suddenly Sarah found herself at the center of attention in a way she had never wanted or expected. People approached her in the grocery store to offer support, to say they had never trusted David, to share their own stories of how he had cheated or manipulated or betrayed them over the years. The local newspaper ran a front-page story with the headline, "Family business owner arrested on federal fraud charges," complete with David's mugshot and a detailed account of the allegations. Sarah's name was mentioned throughout the article, identified as the sister-in-law who had uncovered the fraud, and suddenly she was cast in the role of hero rather than victim, crusader rather than widow. She found this deeply uncomfortable. She had not done this for recognition or praise, had not wanted to become a public figure. But Patricia explained that the publicity was actually helpful, that it would make it harder for David to claim he was being persecuted, that public awareness of the case would help ensure justice was served. The federal indictment came down on a cold morning in early March, exactly 4 months after Sarah had found the hidden documents in the freezer. Patricia called at 7 in the morning to tell her that David had been arrested at his home, that federal marshals had taken him into custody, that the charges included 14 felony counts of wire fraud, tax evasion, money laundering, and theft from an interstate business. The bail hearing was scheduled for that afternoon, and Patricia wanted to know if Sarah planned to attend. Sarah said yes without hesitation, though her hands were shaking as she hung up the phone. She had been waiting for this moment since the day she stood in the empty house and understood what David had done, and now that it was here, she felt strangely calm, as though some part of her had always known this was inevitable. She dressed carefully that morning, choosing clothes that were professional but not expensive, wanted to look like a widow seeking justice rather than a vengeful woman seeking revenge. She drove to the federal courthouse downtown and found Patricia waiting for her on the steps, briefcase in hand and an expression of grim satisfaction on her face. They went through security together and found seats in the courtroom gallery, surrounded by journalists who had caught wind of the case and showed up looking for a story. David was led in through a side door wearing an orange jumpsuit and handcuffs, his face pale and his eyes darting around the room until they landed on Sarah. For a moment their gazes locked, and Sarah saw something in his expression that confirmed everything she had suspected. Not remorse, not fear, but rage. Pure, undiluted rage at being caught, at being exposed, at losing the game he had thought he was winning. He looked at her as though she were the criminal, as though she had betrayed him rather than the other way around. And in that moment, Sarah understood that men like David never accept responsibility for their actions. They always find someone else to blame. The bail hearing was brief but dramatic. David's lawyer, an expensive-looking man in a tailored suit, argued that his client was a respected businessman with deep ties to the community, that he was not a flight risk, that he should be released on his own recognizance pending trial. The federal prosecutor, a sharp young woman named Rebecca Torres, countered by presenting evidence that David had been moving money to offshore accounts, that he had recently applied for a passport under a false name, that he had every reason and means to flee the country if given the chance. She also mentioned, almost casually, that there were questions about David's possible involvement in his brother's death, that the investigation into that incident was being reopened based on new information, and that these circumstances made him an extreme flight risk. The judge, a stern woman in her 60s, listened to both arguments and then set bail at $5 million, an amount so high that it was effectively a denial of release. David would remain in custody until trial. As the marshals led David away, he turned back one more time to look at Sarah, and this time he mouthed 3 words that she could read clearly even across the crowded courtroom. "You'll pay for this." Sarah felt fear flutter in her chest, but was quickly replaced by something stronger, a sense of having crossed a threshold, of having stepped through a door that could not be walked back through. Whatever David had meant as a threat, Sarah heard as an admission. He was guilty. He knew it, and now everyone else would know it too. Patricia squeezed her hand as they stood to leave and whispered, "We got him. It's over." But Sarah knew it was not over. Not really. Not until trial was complete and the verdict was rendered and David was sentenced to whatever punishment the law deemed appropriate. Still, this was a victory, a real tangible victory, and Sarah allowed herself to feel it, to savor it, to carry it home like a precious thing. The news of David's arrest spread to the town like wildfire, and suddenly Sarah found herself at the center of attention in a way she had never wanted or expected. People approached her in the grocery store to offer support, to say they had never trusted David, to share their own stories of how he had cheated or manipulated or betrayed them over the years. The local newspaper ran a front-page story with the headline, "Family Business Owner Arrested on Federal Fraud Charges," complete with David's mugshot and a detailed account of the allegations. Sarah's name was mentioned throughout the article, identified as the sister-in-law who had uncovered the fraud, and suddenly she was cast in the role of hero rather than victim, crusader rather than widow. She found this deeply uncomfortable. She had not done this for recognition or praise, had not wanted to become a public figure. But Patricia explained that the publicity was actually helpful, that it would make it harder for David to claim he was being persecuted, that public awareness of the case would help ensure justice was served. But the publicity had a darker side, too. Sarah started receiving threatening phone calls at odd hours, hang-ups and heavy breathing, and occasional whispered messages telling her to drop the charges or else. Catherine, David's wife, showed up at the house one evening demanding to speak to Sarah, her face twisted with fury as she screamed that Sarah had destroyed their family, that David was innocent, that Sarah was a lying vindictive which would rot in hell for what she had done. Sarah called the police, and Catherine was arrested for violating the restraining order, which only seemed to inflame the situation further. Catherine's family, prominent in local business circles, began a whisper campaign suggesting that Sarah had seduced James away from his true family, that she had always been an outsider with designs on the Mitchell fortune, that David was a victim of an elaborate scheme to steal his inheritance. None of it was true, but truth seemed irrelevant to people who had already decided what they wanted to believe. Through all of this, Sarah tried to maintain normalcy for her children. Emma remained largely insulated from the adult drama, her 7-year-old world still mostly filled with school and friends and elaborate games she invented. But Michael was different. He followed the news obsessively, reading every article about his uncle's arrest, watching every television report, studying the faces of people interviewed about the case as though trying to decode some hidden message. He asked Sarah questions she did not know how to answer. Would Uncle David go to prison? Did he really steal all that money? Did he have something to do with Dad's death? Sarah tried to be honest without being cruel, to explain the legal process without burdening Michael with adult concerns, to let him feel his anger without letting it consume him. It was an impossible balance, and most days she felt like she was failing at it, but she kept trying because that was what parents did. They kept trying even when they did not know what they were doing. The revelation that changed everything came not from the federal case, but from an unexpected source. Sarah received a call from Sergeant Davis, the police officer who had investigated James's accident. He asked if he could come by the house to talk to her about something important, and when Sarah agreed, he arrived that evening carrying a manila folder similar to the ones James had hidden. Davis explained that Arthur Pemberton's testimony about the car fleeing the scene had troubled him enough to request that the accident be re-examined. A colleague had pulled the evidence from storage and had noticed something Davis had missed originally. Security camera footage from a gas station half a mile from the accident site. The footage showed a car matching David's BMW pulling into the station at 11:43 p.m. on the night of James's death, just 9 minutes after the 911 call about the accident had been logged. The driver, whose face was partially visible, was agitated and appeared to be wiping something off the vehicle's front end. Davis showed Sarah the footage on his laptop, grainy black and white images that nonetheless clearly showed David in profile, his distinctive features recognizable even in the poor quality video. Sarah watched in silence as the footage showed David using paper towels from the gas station to wipe at his car, disposing of the towels in the trash, then driving away quickly. Davis explained that investigators had retrieved those paper towels from the station's dumpster. They had been there for months, preserved by chance because the dumpster company had been involved in a labor dispute and had not been emptying trash regularly. The towels had been sent to the state crime lab, and the results had just come back. They contained paint transfer consistent with James's car, along with trace amounts of James's DNA, likely from blood spatter. The room seemed to tilt around Sarah as she processed what Davis was telling her. David had not just witnessed James's accident. He had caused it. He had deliberately run James off the road, had checked to make sure his brother was dead, and had then tried to clean the evidence from his car before fleeing. This was not embezzlement or theft or any white-collar crime that could be rationalized as greed or ambition. This was murder. Premeditated, calculated, cold-blooded murder, committed by a man who had stood beside Sarah at his brother's funeral and promised to help her through her grief while knowing he had caused it. Sarah felt herself becoming disconnected from her body, watching from somewhere above as Davis continued talking about warrants and additional charges, and how the district attorney's office would be coordinating with the federal prosecutors to make sure David faced justice for all his crimes. Patricia arrived within an hour of Sarah's call, summoned by a text that simply read, "He killed James. They have proof." She reviewed Davis's evidence with the focused intensity of someone who has been waiting for exactly this moment, asking questions, taking notes, already thinking 3 steps ahead about how this would affect a federal case and what new legal strategies they would need to employ. But even Patricia, usually so controlled and professional, seemed shaken by the revelation. She had suspected David was capable of theft and fraud, but murder was a different category entirely, a different level of depravity that changed the entire narrative of the case. They were no longer pursuing a white-collar criminal. They were helping to convict someone who had killed to protect his secrets, and would likely kill again if given the chance. The news of the murder charge broke 2 days later, creating a media frenzy that dwarfed the attention given to the federal fraud case. National news outlets picked up the story. Brother murders brother to cover up million-dollar fraud. The headline screamed, and suddenly reporters were camping outside Sarah's house, trying to get interviews, shoving microphones in her face whenever she left to take the children to school. Sarah refused all interview requests, issuing a simple statement through Patricia expressing her grief and her gratitude to law enforcement for their thoroughness. She did not want to become a media personality, did not want her family's tragedy to become entertainment for strangers. She wanted justice, and she wanted to move on with her life, and those 2 things felt increasingly at odds with each other. The preliminary hearing for the murder charge was scheduled for 3 weeks after David's arraignment. Sarah attended with Patricia, sitting in the front row of the gallery where David would have to see her, where she could look him in the eye and let him know that she knew everything, that his secrets had been exposed, that there was no escape. When David was led into the courtroom, he looked like a different person, thinner, older, his expensive suit replaced by prison attire, his confidence replaced by something that looked almost like fear. But when he saw Sarah, that fear transformed instantly into hatred so pure and intense that it felt like a physical presence in the room. He stared at her with such malevolence that the marshal standing beside him put a hand on his shoulder, a silent warning to maintain control. The prosecution presented its case methodically. The security footage, the paint transfer, the DNA evidence, Arthur Pemberton's testimony about the fleeing car, cell phone records showing David's location near the accident site at the time of James's death. Each piece of evidence was damning individually, but together they formed an unbreakable chain linking David to his brother's murder. David's defense attorney, a different lawyer than the one who had handled the bail hearing, tried to poke holes in the evidence, suggesting that the security footage was too grainy to make a positive identification, that the paint transfer could have come from any number of vehicles, that circumstantial evidence was not the same as proof. But even as he spoke, Sarah could see the judge's expression growing more skeptical, more certain that David was guilty not just of theft but of the ultimate crime. When the judge ruled that there was sufficient probable cause to bind David over for trial on first-degree murder charges, Sarah felt something inside her chest finally unlock, some tension that had been coiled there since the day James died. This was not closure. There would be no closure, no return to the life she had before, no way to undo what David had done. But it was acknowledgement. It was the world finally recognizing that James had not died in a random accident, but had been murdered, that his death had not been meaningless bad luck, but the deliberate act of someone who valued money more than brotherhood, who chose violence over accountability, who had killed and then stood at the funeral playing the role of grieving brother, while Sarah and her children sobbed beside the grave. David would pay for that now. He would spend the rest of his life in prison, and every day of that incarceration would be a reminder of the choice he had made, the brother he had killed, the family he had destroyed in pursuit of wealth he would never get to enjoy. The trial took place the following autumn, almost a year after Sarah had returned to the empty house on Maple Drive. By then, the house was no longer empty. Marcus and other friends had helped Sarah furnish it piece by piece, hunting through estate sales and thrift stores to find second-hand furniture that gave the rooms character without costing a fortune. The space had been transformed from a crime scene into a home, filled with the children's laughter and Sarah's gradual healing. Those shadows still linger in corners, and some rooms still felt too full of absence to spend much time in. Sarah had quit her library job to work full-time on writing a book about her experience. Not for fame or money, but because James's therapist, a grief counselor Sarah had finally agreed to see, had suggested that telling the story might help her process everything that had happened. The trial itself lasted 6 weeks, a marathon of testimony and evidence, and legal maneuvering that left Sarah exhausted and numb. She attended every day, sitting in the same seat in the gallery, watching as prosecutors methodically dismantled David's lies and demonstrated his guilt beyond any reasonable doubt. The most difficult moment came when Michael had to testify about the last conversation he had heard between his father and uncle, a phone call that had taken place 2 days before James's death, in which James had confronted David about the embezzlement and given him one final chance to come clean. Michael recounted, in a voice that barely shook, how his father had sounded sad rather than angry, how he had told David that family should be able to work through anything, how he had offered to help David pay back the money if David would just admit what he had done, and how David had responded not with gratitude or remorse, but with threats, saying that James would regret interfering in his business, that there would be consequences for trying to destroy his reputation, that blood was not always thicker than water. The jury deliberated for 3 days before returning with their verdict. Guilty on all counts of first-degree murder. Guilty on all 14 counts of federal fraud. Guilty of theft, embezzlement, and conspiracy. David showed no emotion as the verdicts were read, staring straight ahead as though he had already mentally left the courtroom, already retreated to some internal space where consequences could not reach him. But when the judge announced the sentence, life in prison without possibility of parole, plus an additional 40 years on the fraud charges to run consecutively, David finally broke. He turned in his seat to look at Sarah one last time, and she saw in his face not rage now, but something that looked almost like incomprehension, as though he genuinely could not understand how he had ended up here, how his carefully constructed life had collapsed so completely. Sarah met his gaze without flinching, and in that moment she silently communicated everything she had been carrying: her grief, her fury, her determination, and finally, her release. She was done with him. He no longer had power over her life or her children's lives. He was simply a criminal being led away to face the consequences of his choices. After the trial ended, Sarah took Emma and Michael on a trip they had been planning for months. A week in California, visiting James's favorite places from his childhood, locations he had talked about endlessly but had never had the chance to show his children. They stood on the beach where James had learned to surf, visited the amusement park where he had spent summers working as a teenager, ate at the diner where he had taken Sarah on their first date, when they were both in college, and everything still felt possible. Emma collected shells and played in the waves, her joy uncomplicated and pure, while Michael stood beside his mother watching the sunset and said something that made Sarah's eyes fill with tears. "You think Dad knows we got him? That we made sure Uncle David paid for what he did?" Sarah told him she believed James knew, believed he had been with him throughout the entire ordeal, believed that justice for the dead mattered to the living in ways that were mysterious but real. When they returned home, Sarah found that the house felt different, lighter somehow, as though exorcising David's crimes had lifted a curse that had been hanging over it. She began to think about the future for the first time in more than a year, not just surviving day to day, but actually planning, dreaming, imagining what their lives might become now that they were no longer defined primarily by what had been taken from them. She enrolled in night classes to finish the college degree she had abandoned when Emma was born. She started dating again, tentatively and without expectations, but opening herself to the possibility that love might find her twice in one lifetime. She watched Emma flourish in school, and Michael gradually let go of some of his anger, watched them both learn to carry their father's memory without being crushed beneath its weight. The book Sarah wrote about their experience was published 2 years after David's conviction, and to her surprise, it became a quiet success, not a bestseller but a steady seller, finding its way to readers who had experienced similar betrayals or losses and found comfort in knowing they were not alone. Sarah donated all proceeds from the book to a legal fund that helped widows and children navigate estate disputes and family fraud cases, wanting to turn her tragedy into something that might prevent others from experiencing similar pain. She gave occasional speeches at law schools and victim advocacy groups, always uncomfortable with the attention, but increasingly convinced that telling the story mattered, that silence protected predators while truth protected the vulnerable. On the 5th anniversary of James's death, Sarah and the children returned to the cemetery where he was buried. They brought flowers, sunflowers, which had been his favorite, and stood together beside the headstone that bore his name and the dates that bookend his too short life. Emma read a poem she had written about missing someone you never stop loving. Michael played a recording of a song he had composed on guitar, a melancholy melody that somehow contained hope within its sadness. And Sarah simply stood there with her hands on her children's shoulders, feeling the weight of grief that would never entirely lift but which had, over time, become something she could carry without being destroyed by it. She spoke to James in her mind, telling him about their lives, about how the children were growing, about how she had kept her promise to live rather than merely survive, about how justice had been served even though it could never bring him back. As they walked away from the grave toward the parking lot where their car waited, Sarah looked back one final time and saw how the sunlight fell across the headstone, illuminating the words carved there: James Mitchell, beloved husband, father, brother. She had fought to add that last word, brother, despite everything David had done, because James had loved his brother once, had believed in redemption, had given David chances long after most people would have given up. That capacity for love and forgiveness was part of who James had been, and Sarah wanted it remembered even though David had proven himself unworthy of it. The headstone was not about David. It was about James, about the kind of man he had been, the kind of brother he had tried to be, right up until the moment his belief in family got him killed. That belief had been both his greatest strength and his fatal flaw. And Sarah carried both aspects of it forward into a future that James would never see but had, through his hidden documents and carefully preserved evidence, helped to secure. In that way, he was still protecting them, still providing for them, still being a father and husband he had promised to be, even from beyond death, even from the silence of the grave, even from the place where love persists despite everything that tries to extinguish it.